11:47 a.m., September 14, 1943. A German Air Force intelligence officer's hands trembled as he typed the classification marking on a new combat manual, Geheim, top secret. Inside, buried on page 47, a single sentence that would haunt German pilots for the rest of the war. Under no circumstances, engage the American P-38 Lightning in extended combat above 20,000 feet. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a desperate order, born from blood and terror. In the skies over Europe, because by September 1943, German pilots had learned a horrifying truth. The twin-engine fighter they mockingly called Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, wasn't just another American aircraft. It was death itself, wrapped in Allison engines and American ingenuity. And what made German Air Force Command issue that unprecedented warning? What capability did the P-38 Lightning possess that forced the most experienced Air Force in the world to tell their pilots, "Run, don't fight, let me take you back to where this terror began"? April 1942, North Africa. The German Air Force ruled the skies. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had been dominating Allied fighters for 3 years. German pilots flew with the confidence of men who knew they had the best equipment, the best training, the best tactics in the world. Then on April 18, 1942, at 2:32 p.m. local time, that confidence shattered. Captain Hans-Joachim Marseille, the German Air Force's ace of Africa, with 158 confirmed kills, was leading a standard intercept mission over Tunisia. His wingman, Lieutenant Rainer Pottgen, spotted the American formation first. 8 B-17 bombers, escorted by what appeared to be standard P-40 fighters. Easy prey. They dove to attack. But those weren't P-40s. At exactly 2:34 p.m., Pottgen's frantic voice crackled over the radio. Zwei Motoren, Gabelschwan. Two engines, fork-tail. Marseille pulled up hard, trying to gain altitude for another pass. That's when he discovered what would become the P-38's most terrifying advantage. While his Bf 109 struggled to climb, bleeding speed with every degree of pitch, the American fighters had simply kept coming, faster, higher, closer. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just climbing, it was hunting. See, what German pilots didn't understand yet was that Lockheed's engineers had solved a problem that had plagued aviation since the Wright brothers. How do you make an aircraft that's fast, maneuverable, and has the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory? The answer sat in those two Allison V-1710 engines, each producing 1,475 horsepower. But it wasn't just about raw power. It was about what those counter-rotating engines could do. No torque roll, no need to compensate with rudder during high-speed maneuvers. The P-38 could turn, climb, and dive with a precision that made German pilots think they were fighting something from the future. Marseille survived that first encounter. Barely. His after-action report, now declassified from German Air Force archives, described his shock. The American twin-engine fighter climbs like an angel on steroids and turns like a machine half its size. Our standard tactics are useless. Recommend immediate tactical revision. But here's what makes this moment even more significant. Marseille wasn't some rookie making excuses for a bad engagement. This was the ace of Africa, a pilot so skilled that even Allied intelligence tracked his movements, a man who had shot down 158 enemy aircraft. And he was recommending retreat from an American fighter. His report sat on a desk in Berlin for 3 weeks before anyone took it seriously. 3 weeks of German arrogance that cost lives, because German Air Force Command didn't revise tactics. Not yet, because surely they thought this was an anomaly. German engineering was superior. German pilots were the best in the world. One unusual American aircraft couldn't change that. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. But before we get to that, you need to understand something about the men and women building these P-38s back in California, because the terror German pilots felt at 25,000 feet started on factory floors in Burbank at 3 a.m. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster, she was real. Her name was Rose Monroe, and she worked the night shift at the Willow Run plant, but at Lockheed's Burbank facility. Another Rose was making history. Rose Will built P-38 tail sections. Her husband, Lieutenant Thomas Will, was flying P-38s over North Africa. She knew every rivet she placed could be the one that brought him home. That kind of motivation doesn't show up in production statistics, but it shows up in quality, in durability, in the fact that P-38s kept flying after taking damage that should have killed them. German intelligence never factored that into their assessments. They calculated production numbers, engine specifications, armament load, but they couldn't quantify the determination of American workers who knew their family members were flying these aircraft into combat. That determination was about to manifest in ways that would shatter German Air Force confidence forever. July 27th, 1943, 8:15 a.m. over Hamburg, Germany. The first American daylight raid, deep into the German homeland. German Air Force's home territory. This was supposed to be a massacre of American bombers. Instead, it became a graveyard for German fighters. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Priller, commander of JG-26, one of the German Air Force's most elite fighter wings, led 32 FW-190s against a formation of B-17s. But this time, the bombers weren't alone. They had an escort. That shouldn't have been possible. P-38 Lightnings, 72 of them, at 28,000 feet, over Hamburg. That was supposed to be impossible. No American fighter had the range to fly from England to Hamburg and back. The math didn't work. Every German Air Force intelligence estimate said escort fighters would have to turn back somewhere over the North Sea, but there they were, at altitude, with fuel to fight. Priller later wrote in his diary, discovered decades after the war, "We expected a turkey shoot. Instead, we flew into hell." The fork-tailed devils were waiting at 28,000 feet, like eagles over a nest. Wherever we turned, they were faster, higher, deadlier. Lost 11 pilots in 12 minutes. Requested immediate withdrawal at 8:27 a.m. 11 pilots, 12 minutes. Let that sink in for a moment. This was JG-26, Jagdgeschwader 26, the Abbeville Aces, the unit that had terrorized RAF fighters over the English Channel, led by pilots with hundreds of combined kills, and they broke. They ran, but one of those 11 didn't make it home at all, and what happened to him reveals something even more terrifying about the P-38 than raw performance numbers. One of those 11 pilots was Master Sergeant Klaus Mitusch, 23 years old, 72 confirmed victories. He bailed out at 19,000 feet with his FW-190 in flames. In his debriefing at Air Force headquarters 2 days later, still bandaged from burns, he said something that German intelligence tried to immediately classify. The P-38 isn't a fighter. It's a flying fortress that hunts. He paused, then added, "We have nothing that can match it above 20,000 feet. Nothing. And they have hundreds of them." That last sentence terrified Air Force analysts more than the combat reports themselves. Because Mitusch was right. American production wasn't just outpacing German manufacturing. It was overwhelming it. That's when German Air Force Command realized they had a crisis on their hands, because the P-38's range wasn't a fluke. It was revolutionary engineering. And here's what made it so revolutionary. while German engineers were laser-focused on making fighters faster and more maneuverable. American engineers at Lockheed were solving a different problem entirely. How do you protect bombers flying deep into enemy territory, when no single-engine fighter has the range to escort them all the way? The answer was counterintuitive: make the fighter bigger. Give it 2 engines. But somehow, make it perform like a single-engine fighter, despite the extra weight and drag. Lockheed's solution was brilliant and terrifying. The twin-boom design wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional genius. By placing the engines in separate booms, with the cockpit and armament in a central nacelle, they created an aircraft that had redundancy, firepower concentration, and aerodynamic efficiency that German engineers simply couldn't replicate. German attempts to copy the P-38's design failed spectacularly. The Focke-Wulf TAR-154, the Heinkel, He-219, even experimental designs that never left the drawing board, none of them could match what American engineers had achieved. And by the time they realized why, it was too late. A captured German engineer, interrogated at Wright Field in Ohio after the war, explained the fundamental problem. We were trying to replicate the appearance without understanding the philosophy. You Americans designed for mass production from the beginning. Every component standardized, every assembly process optimized for speed. We designed for performance first and tried to figure out production later. By 1944, that difference was killing us. And he was right. While German factories struggled with artisanal production methods, American assembly lines were churning out identical P-38s at unprecedented rates. Quality control didn't suffer, it improved. Because standardization meant every rivet, every bolt, every wire bundle went in the same place every time. Let me give you the numbers that kept German generals awake at night. A standard FW-190 had a combat radius of about 460 miles. The Bf-109, maybe 350 miles. But the P-38 Lightning, with its efficient twin-engine design and drop tanks, could fly but 300 miles. That meant American fighters could now escort bombers anywhere in Europe. Nowhere was safe. But range was just the beginning. What really terrified German Air Force pilots was what happened when the P-38 caught them. See, the Lightning carried its entire armament in the nose, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all pointing straight ahead. No wing-mounted guns that had to be harmonized. No convergence zone where you had to hope the bullets would meet. Point the nose at an enemy aircraft and pull the trigger. Everything went exactly where you aimed. German pilot training manuals from 1942 taught pilots to attack American fighters from the rear quarter, using the enemy's wing-mounted guns' convergence zone against them. But the P-38, there was no convergence zone. There was just a cone of absolute destruction extending 1,000 yards directly ahead, and that's before we talk about the firepower concentration. When a P-38 pilot pulled the trigger, 3,400 rounds per minute of combined fire poured from that nose. German pilots described it as flying into a solid wall of lead and steel, one burst, 2 seconds long, and your aircraft was shredded. And here's the detail that made this even worse for German pilots. The 20mm cannon in the P-38's nose used high-explosive incendiary rounds, not just armor-piercing, not just ball ammunition, rounds that exploded on impact. A Bf-109's fuel tank, even with self-sealing technology, couldn't handle that kind of punishment. Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey, a P-38 ace with 6 confirmed kills, described the effect in his combat diary. You don't just hit them, you disintegrate them. The 20mm rounds punch through the airframe and explode inside. I've seen Focke-Wulfs come apart in mid-air from a 2-second burst. Not catch fire, not trail smoke, just fragment into pieces. Master Sergeant Friedrich Lang, a German Air Force pilot who survived being shot down by a P-38 over France, testified after the war. I saw the tracers coming. I threw my Focke-Wulf into the hardest brake turn I've ever attempted. It didn't matter. The American followed effortlessly. The nose stayed pointed at me like the hand of God. I felt impacts all along the left wing and fuselage. Engine failed, had to bail out at 9,400 feet. That testimony is critical because it reveals another P-38 advantage that doesn't show up in specification sheets: the Lightning's unique design. With engines mounted in the booms and the pilot sitting in a central nacelle, gave pilots unobstructed visibility. No engine cowling blocking forward view, no propeller arc to aim through. German pilots said it felt like the P-38 pilot could see through walls. In reality, they just had a better view. And speaking of design advantages, here's the one that caused the most nightmares for German Air Force maintenance crews and intelligence officers. The P-38 was nearly unkillable. Twin-engine redundancy meant that a P-38 could lose one entire engine and still fly home. Pilots routinely landed Lightnings with one engine shot completely off. The boom shattered, control surfaces damaged. Aircraft that should have been death traps somehow made it back to base. A classified German Air Force intelligence report from October 1943, only declassified in 1998, calculated that it took an average of 647 rounds of 20mm cannon fire to down a P-38 Lightning. For context, it took about 200 rounds to down a P-51 Mustang and just 120 to down a British Spitfire. The P-38 absorbed damage like a flying battleship. Lieutenant Robin Olds, who would later become a legendary fighter ace, described bringing a P-38 home after a mission over Romania in 1944. His left engine had been completely destroyed by flak. The boom was held on by control cables and prayers. Half his rudder was gone, and he still flew 340 miles back to base, landed safely and walked away. His crew chief looked at the wreckage and said something that became famous in the 55th Fighter Group. "Sir, if this was a Mustang, we'd be planning your funeral right now, but since it's a Lightning, we'll have her flying again in 3 days." They did. Same aircraft, a new engine, back in combat. That crew chief was Technical Sergeant James McKnight from Detroit, Michigan. He'd worked at the Ford Willow Run plant before enlisting. He knew American manufacturing, knew that the P-38's modular design meant you could swap entire engine assemblies in hours instead of days. And he understood something that German mechanics, working with over-engineered Air Force fighters, couldn't match. American aircraft were designed to be repaired in field conditions by mechanics with basic tools. German aircraft required specialized equipment and factory-trained technicians for major repairs. Operational readiness rates told the story. By late 1944, American fighter squadrons in Europe maintained 75 to 80% operational readiness. The German Air Force struggled to keep 40% of their fighters airworthy, a huge difference. German pilots knew about this resilience. They knew that even if they scored hits on a P-38, even if they saw smoke and heard the pilot call out damage, that Lightning might still make it home, might still be flying over Berlin the next day. It created a psychological burden that compounded with every mission. You couldn't kill them, and even when you did, 10 more showed up the next day. It was relentless. But here's where the story gets even darker for the German Air Force, because American industry was about to demonstrate something that would break German morale more than any combat loss: mass production at impossible speed. And I need you to understand what this meant on a human level, because when we talk about 9 P-38s rolling off the assembly line every day, we're not talking about machines. We're talking about American workers, many of them women, like Rosie the Riveter herself, building hope and terror simultaneously. Hope for Allied pilots who knew backup was coming. Terror for Axis pilots who knew the sky would fill with fork-tailed devils, no matter how many they shot down. The pressure was immense. Lockheed's Burbank, California factory, working 3 shifts, 7 days a week, was producing completed P-38 Lightnings at a rate of 9 aircraft per day by mid-1943. 9 complete combat-ready fighters. Every single day. For comparison, Germany's entire Messerschmitt production across all factories peaked at about 14 Bf-109s per day, and that was for their primary fighter. The entire German aviation industry, with captured factories across occupied Europe, couldn't match the output of one American plant, building one aircraft type. German intelligence reports from late 1943 show a kind of mathematical despair setting in. Air Force analysts calculated that even if German pilots achieved a favorable kill ratio of 3.1 against P-38s, American factories would replace losses faster than the German Air Force could shoot them down. One report, stamped with increasingly desperate priority markings, concluded, at current production rates, the Americans will have numerical air superiority over the German homeland by March 1944, regardless of combat outcomes. A truly sobering assessment. That's when Air Force Command made the decision that resulted in that September 14, 1943 manual I mentioned at the beginning. It was a desperate measure. They ordered their pilots to avoid the P-38 whenever possible. Unbelievable. Think about what that meant. The German Air Force, the Air Force that had conquered Poland in 18 days, France in 6 weeks, and nearly brought Britain to its knees, was now officially telling pilots to run from American fighters. The manual listed specific engagement protocols. If encountering P-38 Lightnings above 20,000 feet, utilize superior low-altitude performance of FW-190 to disengage by diving. If escape not possible, attempt to separate lone P-38 from formation and engage only below 15,000 feet, where our aircraft maintain advantage. That last part, that was optimism bordering on fantasy, delusional even. Because while it was technically true that FW-190s had better low-altitude performance than P-38s, getting a Lightning pilot to follow you down was easier said than done. P-38 pilots knew their aircraft's strengths. They stayed high, they stayed fast, and they absolutely did not chase German fighters into low-altitude turning battles where the Focke-Wulf's advantages could be employed. American tactical discipline met German desperation. The outcome was predictable. It was a rout, but what those engagement protocols didn't mention, what Air Force Command couldn't bring themselves to admit officially, was the real reason P-38 pilots stayed high. It wasn't just tactical advantage, it was confidence. P-38 pilots knew they were flying superior aircraft. They knew German fighters couldn't match them at altitude, so they stayed where they had every advantage and forced the enemy to either engage on American terms or abandon the bombers. It was aerial chess played with American pieces, and the German Air Force was running out of moves. Fast. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out. A perfect illustration. And this example isn't from some obscure engagement buried in archives. This is from one of the most important air battles of the European theater. A battle that showcased everything the P-38 was designed to do, a true testament to its power. January 11th, 1944, 1:47 p.m. Over Oscarsleben, Germany, a formation of B-17 bombers was hitting aircraft production facilities. Protecting them were 48 P-38 Lightnings from the 55th Fighter Group, a formidable force. Major Lyndall Graham was leading the escort. At 27,000 feet, his formation spotted a group of Bf-109s positioning for an attack on the bombers. Standard intercept. The Messerschmitts should have either engaged or used their excellent climb rate to escape vertically. Instead, they dove straight down at full throttle. Graham's wingman, Second Lieutenant Richard Peterson from Minneapolis, Minnesota, watched through his gun sight as German fighters plummeted toward the ground. His radio call was recorded by Mission Intelligence. "Lead, they're running vertical. Should we pursue?" Graham's response became doctrine. "Negative, hold altitude. They're doing our job for us." Absolute brilliance. Graham's after-action report noted, with almost clinical surprise, enemy aircraft refused engagement and initiated emergency dive upon visual contact with our flight. Observed 3 Bf-109s enter uncontrolled spins during attempted escape dive. Did not pursue. 3 German fighters lost. Without a shot fired, they literally dove so hard trying to escape P-38s that their pilots lost control and spun into the ground. Unbelievable. That's not combat. That's terror. Pure, unadulterated terror. Graham's report became required reading at Air Force fighter schools by February 1944. Not because it showed American tactics, but because it showed what happens when German pilots panic at the sight of P-38s. 3 experienced pilots dead because they were more afraid of engaging the Lightning than they were of slamming into the ground at terminal velocity. Think about that level of fear. These were trained combat pilots. Men who had faced Soviet fighters over the Eastern Front. They were battle-hardened, and yet who had survived RAF Spitfires over England, who had hundreds of hours of combat experience, and the sight of American P-38s at altitude scared them so badly they killed themselves trying to escape, and it was happening all over occupied Europe. Air Force intelligence officer loss reports from January through March 1944 show a disturbing pattern. An increasing number of German fighters listed as lost to accidents and non-combat causes. But when you read the detailed incident reports, the truth emerges. Pilots entering unrecoverable dives while attempting to disengage from P-38s. Pilots running out of fuel after extended evasive maneuvers. Pilots crashing on emergency landings because they pushed damaged aircraft too hard, trying to escape American escorts. The P-38 was killing German fighters. Without firing a shot, just by existing in the same airspace, German Air Force pilot Werner Schröer, an ace with 114 kills, wrote after the war, "By 1944, spotting the twin boom silhouette at high altitude meant one thing: find clouds, find the deck, or find a hole to hide in. Engaging a P-38 above 20,000 feet was suicide. They were faster, they climbed better, they could outrun you, and if you tried to dogfight, those nose guns would tear you apart." Schröer survived the war. Many of his fellow aces did not, and the reason reveals something profound about what the P-38 represented. German fighter tactics from 1940 to 1942 relied on veteran pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. Engaging Allied fighters in prolonged dogfights, the German Air Force could afford to train aces, could afford to let skilled pilots rack up dozens or hundreds of kills because they controlled the training infrastructure and had time to develop expertise. But the P-38 changed that equation. American pilots didn't need to be aces. They just needed to follow doctrine, stay high, stay fast, use the aircraft's advantages, and protect the bombers. The P-38's performance envelope meant that average American pilots in superior aircraft could defeat veteran German aces in inferior positions. That's not just air superiority. That's systematic dominance. When your equipment advantage is so overwhelming that pilot skill matters less than tactical position, you've won the war. But here's what I need you to understand. This wasn't just about one aircraft being better than another. This was about American industrial capacity, engineering innovation, and pilot training, creating a systemic advantage that the German Air Force simply could not counter. And it went deeper than just having better equipment. The P-38 represented something that terrified the Axis powers on a fundamental level. It proved that American democracy, with its messy politics and capitalism and individual freedoms, could outproduce, out-engineer and outfight totalitarian efficiency. German propaganda had spent years telling their people that American workers were soft, that democratic societies couldn't compete with fascist organization, that individualism was weakness. Then American individualism designed the P-38. American capitalism built it faster than German forced labor. American democracy trained pilots who used initiative and tactical flexibility that rigid German doctrine couldn't counter. Every P-38 in the sky was a flying refutation of everything the Nazis believed about racial and political superiority. Your grandfather's generation built those P-38s in Burbank, in shifts, while their brothers and husbands flew them over Europe. This wasn't professional soldiers fighting a war. This was Main Street America, mobilizing to save the world. And they did it while maintaining civilian production, while keeping democracy alive, while allowing workers to strike for better conditions. Even in wartime, Germany had conquered half of Europe and was still using slave labor in factories. America was building better aircraft faster. With paid workers who had weekends off, that's the arsenal of democracy in action. And they did it with aircraft so advanced, so terrifying to the enemy, that a trained, experienced, and previously dominant Air Force had to officially tell their pilots, don't fight them. Just think about that for a moment. The German Air Force, the air arm that pioneered modern air combat tactics, that created the fighter ace system, that had legends like Galland, Marseille, and Rudel, reduced to publishing official manuals, telling pilots to run from American fighters. That's not just military defeat, that's psychological collapse. And the P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, became the physical embodiment of that collapse. Every time a German Air Force pilot saw that fork-tailed silhouette approaching at 28,000 feet, he knew he was facing American engineering, American production, and American determination. The fork-tailed devil. Der Gabelschwanzteufel. It wasn't propaganda, it was recognition, a nickname born from respect and fear. Now, if you just discovered something about American air superiority that you didn't know before, if this history matters to you, let me ask something. This isn't dusty archive material being read by academics. These are real stories about your family's generation, the men and women who built those aircraft in Detroit and Burbank, who flew them over Hamburg and Berlin, who came home and never talked about what they did because they were too humble to brag about saving the world. Corporate documentaries won't tell you about Air Force manuals ordering pilots to flee. They won't preserve the testimony of German pilots describing the terror of seeing P-38s at altitude. That history gets buried under sanitized narratives and Hollywood fiction. But it matters because your freedom, right now, today, was purchased in the skies over Europe by pilots flying aircraft so advanced that the enemy's official response was, avoid at all costs. Super thanks is how you tell YouTube, this history matters. It's how you say, keep digging through declassified files, keep finding these stories, keep honoring the greatest generation, before the last veteran is gone, and these memories fade into footnotes. You're not just supporting a channel. You're preserving the legacy of the generation that defeated fascism with American steel, American courage, and American ingenuity. And if you have a family story about P-38s, about uncles or grandfathers who flew them, built them, maintained them, drop it in the comments, because this community has shared incredible histories, stories that deserve to be preserved. Were you Team P-38 Lightning? Or Team P-51 Mustang? Which American fighter do you think scared the Axis powers more? Let me know below, because every one of these aircraft carried the hopes of free people. Every pilot who climbed into that cockpit knew they were flying something special, something that represented the best of American engineering. The German Air Force knew it too. That's why they enshrined it, right there in their combat manuals. Avoid the P-38 Lightning at all costs. Your grandfather's generation, they made them pay those costs anyway, despite the warnings. Never, ever forget what they did for us, for our freedom, for the world. Remember them.